Hello viewers, I am Manavjyoti Chaudhary, Assistant Professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering of Assam Downtown University. In this video, I will talk about the round-robin CPU scheduling algorithm. CPU scheduling is the basis of multi-programmed operating systems. By switching the CPU among processes, the operating system can make the computer more productive. The objective of multiprogramming is to have some process running at all times to maximize CPU utilization. For a uniprocessor system, there will never be more than one running process. If there are more processes, the rest will have to wait until the CPU is free and can be rescheduled. The idea of multiprogramming is relatively simple. A process is executed until it must wait, typically for the completion of some input-output operation. In a simple computer system, the CPU would just sit idle. All this waiting time is wasted and no useful work is accomplished. However, with multiprogramming, we try to use this time productively. Several processes are kept in memory at one time. When one process has to wait, the operating system takes the CPU away from that process and gives the CPU to another process. This pattern continues, and every time one process has to wait, another process may take over the use of the CPU. Scheduling is a fundamental operating system function. Almost all computer resources are scheduled before use. The CPU is, of course, one of the primary computer resources. Thus, its scheduling is central to operating system design. Before discussing the round-robin scheduling algorithm, let us get familiar with two terms that are closely associated with CPU scheduling. The first one is waiting time and the other one is turnaround time. Waiting time. The CPU scheduling algorithm does not affect the amount of time during which a process executes or does some input-output operation. It only affects the amount of time that a process spends waiting in the ready queue. Waiting time is the sum of the periods spent waiting in the ready queue. The other term is turnaround time. From the point of view of a particular process, the important criterion is how long it takes to execute that process. The interval from the time of submission of a process to the time of completion is the turnaround time. Turnaround time is the sum of the periods spent waiting to get into memory, waiting in the ready queue, executing on the CPU, and performing some input-output operation. CPU scheduling deals with the problem of deciding which of the processes in the ready queue is to be allocated the CPU. It is always desirable to maximize CPU utilization and throughput, and to minimize turnaround time, waiting time, and response time. In most cases, we optimize the average measure. However, there are circumstances when it is desirable to optimize the minimum or maximum values rather than the average. A system with reasonable and predictable response time may be considered more desirable than a system that is faster on the average but is highly variable. The round-robin scheduling algorithm is designed especially for time-sharing systems. It is similar to FCFS scheduling, but preemption is added to switch between processes. A small unit of time called a time quantum or time slice is defined. A time quantum is generally from 10 to 100 milliseconds. The ready queue is treated as a circular queue. The CPU scheduler goes round the ready queue, allocating the CPU to each process for a time interval of up to one time quantum. To implement round-robin scheduling, we keep the ready queue as a FIFO queue of processes. New processes are added to the tail of the ready queue. The CPU scheduler picks the first process from the ready queue, sets a timer to interrupt after one time quantum, and dispatches the process. Then one of the two things will happen. The process may have a CPU burst of less than 1 time quantum. In this case, the process itself will release the CPU voluntarily. The scheduler will then proceed to the next process in the ready queue. Otherwise, if the CPU burst of the currently running process is longer than 1 time quantum, the timer will go off and will cause an interrupt to the operating system. A context switch will be executed and the process will be put at the tail of the ready queue. The CPU scheduler will then select the next process in the ready queue. The average waiting time under the round-robin policy, however, is often quite long. Let us consider a set of processes where three processes are there, namely P1, P2 and P3, and they arrive to memory at time 0. And the burst times of these three processes are, for process P1 the burst time is 24 milliseconds, for process P2 burst time is 3 milliseconds, and for process P3 the burst time is 3 milliseconds. If we use a time quantum of 4 milliseconds, then process P1 gets the first 4 milliseconds. Since it requires another 20 milliseconds, it is preempted after the first time quantum and the CPU is given to the next process in the queue, that is process P2. Since process P2 does not need 4 milliseconds, it quits before its time quantum expires. The CPU is then given to the next process, that is process P3. Once each process has received one time quantum, the CPU is returned to process P1 for an additional time quantum. The resulting round-robin schedule can be drawn using a Gantt chart, and we can use the Gantt chart to find out the average waiting time of all the three processes. And from this Gantt chart, we find out that the average waiting time for these three processes P1, P2 and P3 is 17 divided by 3, that is 5.66 milliseconds. In the round-robin scheduling algorithm, no process is allocated the CPU for more than one time quantum in a row. If a process's CPU burst time exceeds one time quantum, that process is preempted and is put back in the ready queue. The round-robin scheduling algorithm is preemptive. If there are n processes in the ready queue and the time quantum is q, then each process gets 1 by nth of the CPU time in chunks of at most q time units. Each process must wait no longer than n-1 by q time units until its next time quantum. If the time quantum is very large, the round-robin policy is the same as the FCFS policy, that is first come first served policy. If the time quantum is very small, say 1 microsecond, the round-robin approach is called processor sharing and appears to the users as though each of the n processes has its own processor running at 1 by nth speed of the real processor. The hardware executes one instruction for one set of registers, then goes to the next. This cycle continues, resulting in 10 slow processors rather than one fast one. In software, however, we need also to consider the effect of context switching on the performance of round-robin scheduling. If the time quantum is 1 time unit, then 9 context switches will occur, slowing the execution of the process accordingly. Thus, we want the time quantum to be large with respect to the context switch time. If the context switch time is approximately 10% of the time quantum, then about 10% of the CPU time will be spent in context switch. Turnaround time also depends on the size of the time quantum. The average turnaround time of a set of processes does not necessarily improve as the time quantum size increases. In general, the average turnaround time can be improved if most processes finish their next CPU burst in a single time quantum. If the context switch time is added in, the average turnaround time increases for a smaller time quantum. since more context switches will be required. On the other hand, if the time quantum is too large, round-robin scheduling degenerates to FCFS policy. A rule of thumb is that 80% of the CPU bursts should be shorter than the time quantum. Thank you.